Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're looking at something pretty radical, really pushing the boundaries between biology and, well, space travel.
We are. It's the idea of genetically engineering humans, specifically for Mars colonization.
Yeah, not just building better habitats, but actually changing us to survive there. It's quite something.
It really is. Our main source here is the Sci-Blowing podcast, their episode Biohackers of Mars Genetically Engineered Colonists.
Right, and they really get into the weeds on this. So today, we'll unpack the biological hurdles Mars throws at us, look at the gene editing tools that might make this possible.
And the specific genetic tweaks being talked about. Things like radiation resistance, breathing thinner air.
Our mission really is to help you get a handle on the arguments both for and, crucially, against this approach. Understand the science, but also the massive ethical questions it kicks up.
Exactly. It's about our future identity.
No kidding. The podcast paints this picture. It's seriously harsh. Average temperature, minus 63 Celsius. Brr.
And the atmosphere. Mostly Koyoro, super thin, like less than 1% of Earth's pressure.
Plus, there's no global magnetic field to protect you from cosmic radiation, just constant bombardment.
And any water is basically ice or really salty brine.
The podcast quotes NASA's Chris McKay, which I thought was really vivid. He said living on Mars is like living inside a freezer full of bleach without the door.
Yeah, that really hits home, doesn't it? It shows just how alien it is to our biology.
So the podcast frames colonization almost like biological warfare against nature. It's stark.
And that leads to the core question they pose. What if, instead of changing the whole planet, which is, a monumental task?
We change ourselves, adapt the human body.
Precisely. So let's talk about the tools. How could we even begin to do this?
Okay, yeah, the genetic toolkit. This sounds very sci-fi, but the podcast points to real technology. CRISPR-Cas9 is the big one, right?
That's the headliner, yes. CRISPR-Cas9. For anyone maybe not familiar, think of it as incredibly precise molecular scissors.
Scissors for DNA.
Essentially, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It lets scientists find a specific spot in the genome and make a change, cut, paste, edit. It's like a find and replace function, but for our genetic code.
And it's this precision that makes the idea of human augmentation for Mars seem less like fiction and more like a complex engineering problem.
Right. It's moving beyond just fixing genetic diseases to actively enhancing traits for survival in a hostile environment.
So what specific enhancements are on the table? The podcast starts with radiation, which makes sense given Mars's lack of protection.
And they bring up this amazing little organism, a bacterium called Deinococcus radiodurans.
With its superpower.
It can survive insane levels of radiation. We're talking maybe 1,000 times the dose that would be lethal for a human.
1,000 times? How?
It's all about DNA repair. It has these incredibly robust, multiple backup systems for fixing its genetic code when radiation shatters it. And the podcast mentions research, like work from 2018, where scientists actually managed to transfer some of these radiation resistance genes from Deinococcus into E. coli, another bacterium.
So they proved you could transfer the ability, at least in microbes.
Exactly. It showed the principle works. So the thinking is, could we borrow from Deinococcus's playbook, engineer human cells with, boosted DNA repair mechanisms or better antioxidant systems to cope with Martian radiation?
Like giving ourselves a built-in heavy-duty repair kit. That's wild. Okay, what about the air? Or lack thereof, hypoxia?
Right, the thin Martian atmosphere. Even inside habitats, you might want lower pressure to reduce engineering stress or for potential excursions.
And the podcast connects us to people living at high altitudes on Earth.
Yeah, specifically Tibetan populations. They've adapted over millennia to thrive where oxygen is scarce. Research, like Simonson's work back in 2010, identified a key gene involved called EPAS1.
EPS1, and what does it do?
It helps regulate how the body produces red blood cells and uses oxygen. It makes them much more efficient in low oxygen conditions.
So the idea is tweak the EPAS1 gene in colonists.
Potentially, yes. Give them a genetic advantage for dealing with lower oxygen levels, making them better suited to Martian conditions.
Okay, radiation, oxygen. Then there's the gravity issue. Mars has lower gravity, about 38% of Earth's. We know astronauts lose bone and muscle mass in space.
A major challenge for long stays. The podcast brings up the myostatin gene here.
Myostatin. I think I've heard of this. It limits muscle growth.
Exactly. It acts like a brake on muscle development. There's research, going back to Lee's work in 2004 and studies since, showing that if you inhibit myostatin, basically ease off that brake, you get significantly increased muscle mass. Think of those super muscly mice or cattle.
Right. So apply that to humans going to Mars.
That's the proposal. modify the myostatin gene, or regulate its expression to help colonists retain muscle strength and fight atrophy and lower gravity.
Okay, so we've got potential fixes for radiation, low oxygen muscle loss. It feels like they're sketching out the specs for, like, Martian Human 1.0.
That's a good way to put it. And the podcast doesn't stop there. It pushes into even more uh, speculative territory.
Oh, like what?
Well, beyond just fixing the problems, they touch on actively adding new capabilities, maybe fusing human DNA with genes from other extremophile organisms that live in boiling water or extreme cold or pressure.
Taking inspiration from life that already thrives in harsh places.
Precisely. They even float ideas about adapting lungs and blood cells to be more efficient with co-Euro, which is abundant on Mars.
And it wasn't just physical stuff, right? They mentioned cognition, too.
Yeah, enhancing cognitive functions to handle the intense isolation, the high-stress environment, improving focus or emotional resilience, perhaps.
Wow. And then there were the really out there ideas from synthetic biology.
Right. Things like engineering bioluminescence, maybe for navigating dark lava tubes or habitats.
Or even skin that could perform a tiny bit of photosynthesis, like chloroplasts.
Yeah, or enzymes that are more resistant to heat or cold. It starts to sound like, as the podcast puts it, posthumanism meets survival engineering.
Which inevitably slams us right into the ethics of it all. If we can do this, should we?
The podcast pivots hard into that ethical minefield, and it's deep.
The first big one they raise is consent, isn't it?
Absolutely. If you make heritable changes, edits that get passed down, future generations born on Mars inherit these altered genomes. They never consented.
They're born into a biological framework chosen for them. That's heavy.
Very. And then there's the potential for inequality. The podcast asks, could this create a kind of biological class system? Earthborn versus Mars engineered.
A literal genetic divide between populations that could have huge social consequences.
Huge. And it leads to the ultimate question. If Martians become genetically distinct enough, are they still human? What does human even mean then?
Where do we draw the line? It's a massive philosophical question.
The podcast notes that bioethics is kind of scrambling to keep up with the pace of the science here. They mention this idea of cosmopolitan bioethics. Maybe ethical standards themselves will need to evolve as we move off-world.
It's mind-bending. But, as the podcast points out, this isn't all just theoretical anymore, is it? Gene editing is happening.
It is. We have gene therapies being used now for diseases like sickle cell or certain cancers. There was the controversial use of CRISPR on embryos in China a few years back.
Right, the He Jiankui case.
And even spaceflight itself changes us. NASA's twins study showed changes in Scott Kelly's gene expression after his year in space compared to his twin on Earth.
So our biology isn't static anyway. Space changes us, even without direct editing.
Exactly. And the podcast also gives a nod to the sort of DIY biohacker movement groups like the Odin or BioViva experimenting outside the big institutions. It suggests the technology is becoming more accessible, for better or worse.
Which makes that thought experiment they posed really hit home. Imagine applying to a Mars colonist school, and the application asks for your consent to potential genetic enhancements.
Yeah. How far away is that? Really, it forces you to confront it.
Okay, let's shift slightly. The podcast also talked about the mind, the psychological endurance needed for Mars.
Right. The isolation, the confinement, the constant high stakes. It's an immense mental challenge.
And they suggest genetics might play a role there too, like engineering for mental resilience.
They explore that possibility, yeah. Looking at research into genes linked to neurotransmitters and stress responses, things like dopamine receptors, which relate to motivation and reward.
Okay.
Or oxytocin systems involved in empathy and social bonding, may be important for small, isolated crews. Or even pathways controlling stress hormones like cortisol.
So could we select or even engineer colonists for what the podcast calls neurological fortitude?
It's a provocative question they raise. Could future Martians be optimized for traits like calmness, focus, maybe reduced anxiety? They playfully tossed out the term neuroengineered monks.
Wow. Optimized for peace and survival in that environment. It's another layer entirely. Engineering the mind, not just the body.
And this all builds towards the podcast's final, really big picture idea about the long-term future.
Which is
That this isn't just about survival or setting up an outpost. Over generations, these engineered adaptations, combined with the intense environmental pressures of Mars, could lead to speciation.
speciation, like a new human species.
That's the implication. A branching off. If Martian humans become sufficiently genetically different, adapted specifically to Mars, they might eventually become a distinct lineage. Homo martis, perhaps.
Goodness, that's a profound thought. The podcast paints this picture of future Martians, maybe with different physical traits like skin adapted to radiation.
Children born who've never known Earth's environment. A culture completely shaped by their unique biology and planet.
A culture built around this biotech symbiosis.
And the podcast suggests that, from their perspective, Earth wouldn't be home. It would be the ancestral planet, the place their distant forebears came from.
It completely reframes the whole endeavor, doesn't it? From colonization to evolution.
It really does. It pushes the timescale way out.
Okay, so let's try and wrap our heads around this. We face these immense, almost insurmountable challenges on Mars. Our technology for editing life itself is advancing at lightning speed. It forces you, the listener, to really grapple with this. As we reach for the stars, what parts of being human are we willing to change? What's fundamental and what's negotiable?
Where do we draw the line, if we draw one at all?
Is that drive to explore, to colonize, worth potentially redefining the very essence of what it means to be human?
That's the core question the Sci-Blowing podcast leaves us with. It's not just about the science or the ethics of the how, but the deep philosophical implications of the why and what we become. It certainly gives you a lot to think about.